How many times has Britain been colonised by new people? And were there really cannibals in Somerset? Hello, I'm Mike Pitts. I've written a book about ancient Britain, and I want to tell you why I did it. Why so much we thought we knew about the ancient past has changed, and why I think this makes Britain rather a special place. So join me in a quick journey going back 1,000,000 years. So, there are principally 3 reasons why we know so much more about the past than we did when I was at school. And I mean really know. To take one example, people used to think that humans, early humans, first arrived in Britain around 200,000 years ago. Now we know there were people here nearly 1,000,000 years ago, perhaps even longer than that. That's a huge amount of time. That's 650,000 years been added to history. We're not just reinventing history, we're conjuring it from scratch. The first source of new information is excavation. That's Time Team, but bigger. Much bigger. The change began in 1990, some 30 years ago. A good way to see this is to ask how many archaeologists there are, which is pretty much a guide to how many digs. For most of the last century, there were very few. Most excavations, even the Sutton Hoo ship burial, were run by people who could afford to do them without being paid, or as part of a job that was meant to be something else, like being a museum curator or a university lecturer. In the 1970s, archaeologists started to protest about all the archaeology that was being destroyed by new developments, especially in historic towns. They had some success. The government employed archaeologists to excavate sites, and so did some local councils. There had never been so many archaeologists. But destruction without record continued. It was in 1990, after some dramatic discoveries in builders' trenches, among them the Rose Theatre in London, that things really changed. The government told planning officers to think about ancient remains when they considered proposals for new buildings or car parks. Most development went on just as before, but now developers had to pay archaeologists to excavate before their works began. There'd been nothing like it before. No one quite knew where it was going to go. But the effect was spectacular. Suddenly, archaeologists were being paid to excavate at sites chosen by planning officers. Nothing like this had ever happened before on such a scale. And as the number of digs increased, so did the number of archaeologists. It continues today. The archaeology in the ground is still destroyed when something like a house is built, as it always had been. But now, artefacts and bones are saved for a museum, and other remains, such as signs that a house had been there or the shape of a grave, are properly recorded. A good name for this is hard hat archaeology. My colleagues are part of the building trade, in full high-vis kit with steel-toed boots, health and safety rules, and mugs of tea. They're out on site before the main works start, in all weathers and times of year, breaking ice, wallowing in mud, sweating in the sun. You'll see them at roadworks, office developments, new housing estates, airfields, and wind farms, anything that breaks ground. That includes the bed of the North Sea, or the route of HS2, or a road tunnel by Stonehenge. There are now up to 7,000 archaeologists out there. Depending on the health of the economy, on how much building is happening, they find a lot of archaeology. The second thing that's changed is the number of other people finding and reporting things. Now, most of us don't own a metal detector. There's a lot of research being done without them, and many of the things being found, of course, are not made of metal. But Detectorists are by far the most active single group of amateur archaeologists. They can stand for us all. We may not own a detector, but we can be a detectorist. Like digging, there is a moment when things changed with metal detecting. Again, it happened in the 1990s. A Treasure Act was passed in 1996. Anyone finding something in England, Wales and Northern Ireland on a list of particularly important or special items, Scotland has its own rules, has to report it. Governments publish annual lists of treasure finds. The total has grown to over 15,000. Here are a few from the latest reports. This is a Bronze Age rapier from Dorset, found with other bronzes made around 1200 BC. What's really unusual about this sword is that the handle is made of metal as well as the blade. This is a rare medieval seal from Norfolk, set in a gold mount. The gem features an elephant with a little castle on its back, a reminder that Henry III had a live elephant at the Tower of London, given to him by the King of France. And these are beautifully fresh gold coins from the reigns of Edward III and Richard II, found in Powys. Now, if a museum wants a treasure item, it can buy it at full value. If not, the finder can sell it. No surprise, valuable treasure finds make press headlines. Now, these are just a few pieces from the Anglo-Saxon Staffordshire hoard, unearthed in 2009. The landowner and the finder shared £3,285,000, the most yet paid for a treasure find. Most finds are worth a lot less. Most finds, as Lance and Andy and their Detectorist friends will tell you, are worth nothing. But many, huge numbers, have real historical value. After the Treasure Act was passed, archaeologists launched the Portable Antiquities Scheme. This helps detectorists identify their finds and record them in a database. To date, over 1.5 million finds have been logged this way, and these are only the ones deemed to be of historic interest. This is a staggering achievement, and it's one admired around the world. So we're finding huge amounts of ancient remains, more than archaeologists ever imagined actually existed. But that's only half of the story. The other part is science, what we can do with all those finds. Archaeology is riding on a scientific revolution. Digitisation, new technologies, global networking and investment in research. You could say that archaeologists are CSIs, crime scene investigators, except we're looking for clues about all of life, not just crimes. Well, most of the time anyway. What we can do, it feels, is limited only by our imaginations. We can recreate lost worlds from what's in mud. Pollen, wood, beetles, animal bones, snail shells. Anything that survives and we can see in our hand or under a microscope can help us regrow ancient forests. We can cover Britain in glaciers, put hippos in the Thames. Lasers can help us understand how the stones of Stonehenge were carved, or who walked in Norfolk nearly 1 million years ago. These are footprints left in river mud at Haysborough by an unknown species of human. 3D electronic microscopes can show marks on human bones that reveal, yes, there were cannibals in Somerset 15,000 years ago. Trace elements identified by electron probes, mass spectrometry and other techniques are telling new stories about rocks and minerals. Garnets in the Staffordshire hoard came from Central Europe and South Asia, or glass beads found at the Bronze Age village at Must Farm were made in the Mediterranean area. And while we're at Must Farm, forensic studies have shown the village was less than a year old when everything in it, including even a dog that might have been tied to a post, was destroyed by fire deliberately set in every house. There are many more examples, but 3 sciences in particular are key to the stories we're now revealing about ancient Britain. These are radiocarbon dating, isotope analysis, and ancient DNA. Radiocarbon dating can tell us exactly what happened and when. Isotopes in human remains can sometimes show that people grew up in places far from where we find them buried. This great pit excavated in Dorset held the beheaded remains of 52 men. Perhaps they were native warriors killed by an invading Roman army, but radiocarbon dating showed they died too recently for that, in Anglo-Saxon times. Had they been slaughtered by Vikings then? Well, no. Isotope analysis said that some had come from Eastern Europe, others from Russia, Scandinavia, and all the way to Iceland. They were Vikings. In Roman London, everyone was a migrant. Victorian cities were swelled by people from the countryside who came to work in factories. But London at the start was created from scratch. Latin was a common language. People came from all over the empire, or even beyond. Isotopes suggest 2 men had Indian or Chinese ancestry. There were, of course, many people from Africa. 5 people were buried in this pit in Kent nearly 3,000 years ago. 3 of them could have been local, but a man was born in northern continental Europe or Scandinavia, and a young girl in southern Spain, or even Africa. This man was buried near Stonehenge over 4,000 years ago. His treasures are unmatched for the time anywhere in Britain. Isotopes say he was born in Central Europe, and he had a Swiss-style bone pin. Ancient DNA can also tell us stories about people. The bones in this grave in Roman London look like those of a teenage girl. But his DNA was male. They were intersex. This is a folding knife with an ivory handle carved like a leopard. The knife was taken to her grave by a Roman Londoner who was buried in African style. Isotopes confirm that she grew up in the southern Mediterranean, but her DNA said she was a white European. Let's go back to the Stonehenge area. Here's another young woman. She was buried on Porton Down, near the government science centre that is now a key player in UK COVID-19 defence. She was in her early 20s, and she cradled a newborn child so that their faces touched. Perhaps they both died during the birth. Now, quite a few burials around Stonehenge have been analysed for ancient DNA. DNA from this woman's bones shows that she was related to a man buried 3 miles to the north. He was her father. It turned out that another man buried close by was her father's cousin, and over the hill was a grave holding the remains of the 2 men's uncle. He took a few treasures with him into the ground, some of them similar to things we saw in that astonishing grave earlier. The pots and the arrowheads are of continental European style. Now, none of these people had any substantial ancestry from the native farming populations. They were all descended from recent immigrants. This man, we know him as Cheddar Man, died 10,000 years ago, long before the first farmers had arrived. No one had predicted that he had black skin, but that's what his DNA shows. He wasn't a migrant, he was a native Briton, descended from the first people who had come back into southern England when the climate warmed at the end of the Ice Age. Everyone in Europe at that time, hunter-gatherers before anyone was farming, looked the same. Here, DNA is telling us not just about individuals, but whole populations, and it tells us that when the first farmers did arrive around 6,000 years ago, from a long line of ancestors back to the Middle East, they became the new natives. The hunter-gatherers disappeared, to be replaced by people with lighter, but not white, skin and dark hair. In another 1,500 years there was another migration, of white-skinned people who brought new ideas and new technologies, those decorated pots and metalworking among them. So really, how many times has Britain been colonised by new peoples? My guess, let's go right back to the beginning, those footprints at Haysborough, nearly 1 million years ago. My guess is 20 times. When we go back that far, we are literally talking about new people, new human species, perhaps even 2 or 3 before Neanderthals arrived, and after them us, modern humans. 20 times. This is why, in my book, I say that we, Britain, are a nation of migrants. The Bible, For centuries, such a central part of our Christian culture tells us that God created us in the Garden of Eden. But we don't need to go east for our origin story. Britain has its own myth. It was written down in AD 800. It's not a creation story, it's about migration. Brutus, it goes, was descended from a Trojan hero in Turkey. Here he is being carried out of Troy by his father, Aeneas. That didn't work out so well. Later, Brutus accidentally killed his father. He fled to Italy, was chased into France, and eventually settled in some uninhabited islands, which he called after himself, as you do, Britain. In today's words, Brutus was a Mediterranean refugee, and that is the story of digging up Britain. Our ancient past was long, varied, always changing. Our people change, moving from place to place, journeying around the islands, trading and migrating, in and out. We are a mixed people today, and we always have been. Digging Up Britain tells this story through 10 new excavations and discoveries. We visit the sites, we meet the archaeologists, see them at work, share their excitement. All this is in this book. But while we're here, in the woods, I wanted to show you one more thing. So we're in Wiltshire, and this is West Woods. And under these trees is concealed one of the great fields of sarsen. These boulders, these rocks, scattered over the chalk downland like flocks of sheep. And what's special about these is that this is the type of stone that was used to build the megalithic circles at Avebury, just down the road here, and at Stonehenge further south, that direction. I've been walking and running in these woods for many years because I live nearby, and I've come to love these stones. They jump out at you where you least expect them. Every stone is different, and every time you see the same stone it looks different. There's something extraordinary, primeval, almost surreal about these stones on the chalk downland. So when I learnt only last year that a scientific project had determined that some of these stones were taken from these woods to Stonehenge, I was very excited. And I don't mean taken to Stonehenge a couple of years ago for an experiment. I mean to build Stonehenge 4,500 years ago. The people who built the Stonehenge we know came up here looking for sarsen boulders in the same way that I do now when I walk through the woods. But they were on a different mission. They were looking for really big stones that they had to dress, carve down, dig out and drag 20 miles to the south. So now when I walk through the woods, I imagine these people, I see them sometimes, I think of them hiding behind a tree looking for these great boulders, and I wonder, what are they thinking? They must know why they're here, why they're doing this, and it's something we can only guess. But there's something magic about the idea that in this place where I now stand, there were people like me, but from a completely different world and different culture, with their own ideas, seeing the same essence of landscape that I now see. And there's something special about it when I touch this boulder and thinking, somebody 4,500 years ago might have seen this very stone. And there's something about ancient Britain that is there in the present, wherever we go. This is a public place. There are footpaths that go through these woods. Anybody can come here. And that, for me, is what Digging Up Britain is about. It's ancient past is part of our modern world.